As you head to your internship and to the industry and going to your different career paths, as a chemical professional, remember you've got a privileged position with the expert knowledge, and that comes with a set of responsibilities, that you must adhere to. And actually, most of those responsibilities often are to the public, but also, to the people that you're working with. So today we're going to look at the Chemical Professionals Code of Conduct, the ethics and guidelines, what we call the Chemist's Creed, which is a regulatory set of guidelines that all chemical professionals are required to adhere to, actually by legislation. So the Chemist's Creed, the Chemical Professionals Code of Conduct, actually came initially, from this organization, called the American Chemical Society, which is the world's largest association of professional scientists. And this organization was the one that was initially responsible for defining the guidelines for chemical professionals with regard to how they should responsibly go about their responsibilities in light of their professions. And so the Chemist's Creed, has gone through a couple of adulteration, over the years. But it initially started, in 1965, and then after that there has been numerous adulterations or improvements or amendments, I would call them. And the current revision, of the Chemist's Creed, was adopted in December, 2016. Now, of course, there's a reason, to why it's very important, to have chemists, regulated in some way. Now, chemical industry is a huge industry. If you look at the world's GDP, it accounts for up to 5.7 trillion US dollars, of the global GDP, related to aspects of chemical technology. Now, in the US alone, in 2019, it's reported, that about $600 billion, came actually, from the chemical industry. And so it's a very, very big industry, up to about 120 million jobs across the globe, even more, can be attributed, to the chemical industry. And so it's a very, very big industry with a lot of potential actually to grow in certain sectors, particularly, the clean, green energy technologies, the sensor devices, pharmaceuticals, you can see all these things about the different vaccines, that are being developed, they are in the purview of chemical technology. The smart, sensors, talk about your smart watches and so on. So it's got a very huge possibility, to grow in the future, particularly, in those nano technology-based, materials. So you can see it accounts, for up to close to 10%, really, of the world GDP with potential to grow. And so it's a very vast, field or industry, and as such, it needs to be regulated. Not to mention, it accounts, for a lot of improvement in the lifestyles of people in terms of our products and services. And so equally, for the sake of the public, we need to be regulated by adhering, to a certain set of code of conduct. So the Chemist's Creed, again, by the ACS, indicates, the chemical scientist's set of personal responsibilities, okay? And I'm gonna highlight, those set of personal responsibilities that are required, of all chemical scientists with regard or according, to the chemist's creed. And so all of us really in this room, we need to be responsible in the following guidelines. So chemical professionals, should treat colleagues, and if at all you are in a position of mentorship, you should treat the students, and all of us at some point are gonna be in a position of mentorship, be it peer-peer mentorship, or like myself, faculty student mentorship. So all of us, are required to be respectful. We are required to be fair. We are required to encourage each other and learn from each other, share ideas honestly, and this is important, give credit, for everyone's contribution. So you have to acknowledge, work that has been done by others. So don't take the credit, of other people. Now, we are supposed to avoid any bias, and I think this one is very important in the day and age we live in, where we are trying to improve the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which we've done very, very poorly in historically, and we need to do better. And so we need to avoid any bias based on race, gender, age, religion, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, or presence of disabilities. And this is important too. Educational background, so whether, you've got, peers that are not as skilled as one is, we need to avoid any biases related to educational background or other personal attributes. So everyone's contribution and views essentially should be respected, irrespective of their place in terms of their educational background. So another responsibility for all professional chemists, and that's us and you, maintaining high standards of honesty, integrity, respect, confidentiality, and this is very important, especially as you go to the industry. Every industry has got its own intellectual property, and so it's very important, for you to respect, the industry's intellectual property and not share the details of that unless you have got approval, from the relevant, authorities in that industry. Now, we are to show diligence in the conduct of teaching, for example, us, chemical professionals, who are instructors and teachers. We are also to show diligence in the conduct of research and in other professional responsibilities. Okay? So this is important to us, as instructors, and all of us, as I said, we're gonna be involved in some form of peer mentorship. Chemical professionals, should regard tutelage of students as a trust conferred by them by the public. And so professors and so on, they should really, and I do consider the tutorage and the training of students as a trust, as a privilege, that is conferred to us, by the society. As a chemical professional, we are required to seek to advance the chemical science. However, we need to also understand that we are limited, within the disciplinary knowledge. There are limitations within it. And I think that creates some sense of humility as well, to know that we don't understand everything within the discipline. And as such, we should respect the truth, despite, some of the limitations, of the field. And this encourages us really, to be interdisciplinary as well, and to be able to listen to each other and to bring, this diversity, of interdisciplinary engagement, so that hopefully, we can know the whole truth, by bringing different disciplines and diversities on board. You get to get a better picture, of the nature of things. And so the chemical professional should also ensure that their scientific contributions and those of their collaborators are thorough, they're accurate, very important, and they are unbiased. They're unbiased both in the design, in the implementation, as well as in the dissemination. We do not stretch the truth. We do not stretch the data, in as required of chemical professionals. We present, the data as it is. Chemical professionals, are required to ensure that there are no conflicts of interests or any scientific misconduct such as fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and so on are not acceptable, of professional chemists. Other responsibilities: chemical professionals should actively be concerned with the safety and well-being of their peers, their co-workers, as well as the consumers, possibly of the product, that they are developing or producing. Chemical professionals, should serve, and this is important, the public interest. And as such, they should advance the knowledge of science for the sake of the public. And so think of a professional chemist, really, as a civic duty. So you're supposed, to work, within the constraints, that are good, for the public interest. We're not supposed to exaggerate, the truth in our data, or probably make up unsubstantiated, comments, related to our data, or even make premature statements. We should always make sure that the data that we present and how we present it is accurate. And that's a civic duty. As professional chemists, we should strive to do our work within a safe environment. And that's why, the very first thing that you're going to do before you go to the industry is actually to do your WHEMIS training. And that should be done as a requirement, really, of professional chemists, so that we can work safely. We are to ensure that the responsibility, that we understand the impact of our work, to the environment. And so think about all this idea of developing products, that are sustainable. And I think that's going to be a key feature, of our discipline, to make sure the products that we produce out there, they are sustainable. And essentially, that's being responsible, to the public as well. Professional chemists are required, to communicate accurately, with good oral and written skills as well. And again, that's why I emphasize, the need to develop the skill sets necessary, to communicate effectively, as scientists, as professional chemists. And most importantly, we are not just supposed to communicate effectively to those within the discipline, but we are supposed essentially to communicate effectively also to the public. And so the idea of being able to distill, the expert technical aspect, of your practice and communicate that, to somebody who is not an expert in the field, really is a requirement of what we should be doing as well. And I must say, we've not done very well in the past in terms of communicating, the science to the general public. That's why to some extent, you've got some aspects of the general public vilifying, some of the aspects in the science. And it's largely because of our inability to communicate very effectively, to the general public. And so I think that's a skill that we totally really need to continue to develop, communicating effectively to scientists as well as non-scientists. Essentially, again, is a civic duty and a responsibility of of chemical professionals. So also we are supposed to participate in lifelong learning through education and professional development. And so essentially, we should always be attempting, to advance our knowledge, in the field and how it intersects, with the society. So it's a journey, it's a lifelong journey, of learning. And again, that's a requirement or a responsibility, really, of professional chemists, according to the Chemists' Creed. Now, the ACS, American Chemical Society ethical standards that I just talked about in terms of the responsibilities of the chemical professional, and of course this one is in the US, they've been adopted, by other regulatory chemical professionals, regulatory associations, across different places. Like in Alberta, they've been adopted by the so-called ACPA, which is the Chemical Professionals Designating Body in Alberta, okay? And I would encourage you actually to consider being a member. You can be a member even as an undergraduate student. There's what they call the Chemists in Training membership, where you've got, almost nearly the same services, that you can get as the professional chemist in ACPA. And so as a CIT or the chemist in training, you've got really the same, I should say, privileges, you've got the same privileges, as a professional chemist, under the ACPA. And so their membership is cheaper, for the graduate, students. It's around $100, per annum. But for professional chemists like myself, I think I pay around, I think it's $270, per annum as a professional chemist under the ACPA. Now, as a CIT member, you are required actually to take what they call a jurisprudence course, and as well, ensure that you adhere, to the professional ethics, that they outline, which are exactly the same as what I've just highlighted based on the Chemist's Creed. Now, they also require you every year to submit the amount of work that you have done as a professional chemist to ensure, that you have this idea of lifelong learning and you're keeping up to date, with the changing aspects within the field. And so that's all that I'm gonna say, about the Chemist's Creed, and I hope it's clear to us what our responsibilities are as we go out, to the industry. So the next thing that I'm gonna talk about, is the GLP and the GMP, which really highly overlap, with the professional chemist ethics, that I just talked about. And the GLP and the GMP, are government regulations, for chemical industries that they all have to adhere to. And as such, as you go to the industry, these would be the requirements of what you'll have to adhere to as you do your practice in the industry. Now, depending on the type of industry you're going to, if at all you're going to analytical labs, often they would follow the GLP. If at all you're going to a manufacturing organization, maybe like pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing drugs. Often they would adhere to both the GLP, especially for the quality control section, and the GMP, which refers to good, manufacturing, practices. And as I said, there's a lot of overlap, between the GMP and the GLP. So first, let me talk about the GLP, because I think it's the most overarching, practice, that cuts across, both the labs, the monitoring labs, as well as, the manufacturing, chemical manufacturing organizations. So the GLP, or the good laboratory practices, really was started, by the Food, Drug and Administration, the US Food, Drug and Administration. And I'm going to take you through the chronology of how it came to be. And it provides a regulation, that embodies a set of principles, that guide the organizational process and the framework within which analytical studies, should be planned, they should be performed, they should be monitored, and how the data should be recorded, stored, and even reported. So it's an overarching set of guidelines, on how laboratory work, should be performed. And all this, should happen, or should happen within what they call the standard operating procedures. So essentially, the GLP underlines a well-documented standard operating procedures on how, the work should be planned, on how the work should be performed, on how the work should be monitored, and the data, should be stored and should be stored and so on. So GLP is not just, standards such as lab safety. It accounts, for a lot more, as I have described. And so if at all you took Chem 211 and 311, you've heard me really emphasize the need, for you to acquire the necessary aspects of the GLP, even in academic labs, because essentially that's what you're going to be required to do, in the industry. And so it's very, very important. And as you go to the industry, you're going to see it's a huge requirement. And again, it's a government regulation that all of us need to adhere to because of the privilege really accorded and the importance accorded, to what we do in terms of, protecting the public who we serve. So let me very quickly, take you through, the history and the inception of where the GLP actually came from and why it did. Okay. Now, as you all know, guidelines, almost always, or policy, almost always start, from a problem. And yes, a problem, was identified, particularly started in the US. In the early 1970s, the Food, Drug and Administration in the US, they became aware of poor laboratory practices across many labs, but especially the clinical labs, toxicology labs, that were required to be involved in the approval of, or rather in the study, of certain types of chemical compounds used for clinical applications, as well as, used for cosmetic, applications and so on. So it started mainly, with poor laboratory practices, in toxicology labs, in the US. So again, in the 1970s, the FDA decided to carry out an investigation, of up to 40 toxicology labs, there. So they discovered fraudulent, activities, and poor laboratory practices, some of which I'm going to highlight in the next slide. And so in response to that, they created a set of guidelines, what they call the good laboratory practices, which were adopted, by the FDA in 1978. And so it became a requirement, that all companies in the US must adhere, all companies, meaning the chemical industries, must adhere, to the Food and Drug Administration guidelines, on the GLP. Any non-US company that wanted to do business in the US was equally required to comply with the GLP regulations. And so for that reason, that spread to all other countries. And for example, in 1981, the OECD countries also decided to adopt, within their geographical locations, the principles, of the GLP. And for that reason, it became an international standard. So this is what they found, the FDA, when they did, that audit, of those 40 toxicology labs. And a particular example, that was very, very messy, what they actually found was particularly, from this company, the Industrial Biotest, which was carrying out, some clinical studies of some compounds, by Procter & Gamble that were supposed to be used, in cosmetic formulations. And so when they did that, they found that the products, they reported, that the products, are fairly safe to use, and the Procter & Gamble, went ahead and started using, the cosmetics and commercialize the cosmetics, and of course people started to use them. However, it was discovered by the FDA that during the studies, now this particular company, had failed, had falsified the results, in which, some of the animals that they had studied, the compounds with, had developed, problems, such as cancers and so forth, which were not reported. And so they found actually, the companies had falsified the data. They also found, poor lab practices, were used. They also found, that the companies, did not adhere to standard operating, procedures. They also found, poor animal husbandry, for the, for the animals that developed actually the disease, and they died, they just simply disposed them, and they did not actually report that, to the actual company. And unfortunately, the products, that were marketed, also caused problems, to the people in terms of people developing, cancers and so forth. And so for that reason, there were consequences, particularly for the study personnel and the study directors of these companies, as they actually went to jail, because of data falsification. And of course, you can see the very bad impact of what happened in terms of the safety of the general public, which was affected, by their poor ethics in how they did the work. And so the purpose, really, and the objectives for GLP, if I should summarize, is to ensure that the data is quality. That the data that you produce is a true reflection, of the results, that were obtained in the study. So even though maybe the results were not what was expected, it should be that the data should be reported as accurately as possible. So that is a true reflection of the study. In essence, we should not falsify, the data. So the data should also be traceable, okay? And that was a problem, that they realized, with this particular company, that the data was not traceable, and that's why we emphasize, for example, for the lab notebook, the documentation, needs to be very clear, and essentially it should be clear, to the person who is reading it. Okay, so the document should be very, very clear to external audience. So the GLP objective and purpose also is to promote, the international acceptance, of the tests, that have been performed. The other objective, is to promote, of course, the validity, and the quality, of the data that is generated. And of course, very important, the overarching objective really is to protect the people and the environment as well. And of course, the animals possibly, that are involved. And so the other aspect, the GLP again is to ensure quality assurance, of the data that is generated. So take note of this. The scope of the GLP is actually very, very vast. Meaning we observe GLP practices, in lots of different industries, industrial chemicals, food and feed additives, veterinary drugs, pesticide, formulation or pharmaceutical formulation, the cosmetic industry and so on. And so it's a very overarching, set of guidelines that essentially almost bind in any chemical technology or in a chemical industry, out there. And of course, the chemical industry refers to even food, and so on. So the fundamentals, very quickly, the fundamentals of the OECD GLP principles, encapsulate, the resources, rules, characterization and documentation, as well as, the quality assurance, of the data that is generated. So for example, under the GLP practices, the resources, meaning the personnel, the facilities must be adequate, for whatever work is being performed. And that's why it's important, you as a personnel, you must be adequately trained, to effectively do the work that you are required to do. You shouldn't do the work if at all you are not effectively trained to actually do the work. Because of course that's going to impact, the results and the data that you obtain. So it's required, that the personnel, as well as the facilities that are used, as well as, say, the analytical instrumentation that are used, all of them, they should be appropriate, for the work, that is to be performed to ensure the high quality of the results that's expected. So some of the rules or the prescriptive documents, refers to the protocol, particularly the standard operating procedures. They must be very well documented, right from the study design, through to the chronology in very, very fine details of how everything, should actually be done, including, the protocols to how the instruments, should be run, and also, how the instruments should be cleaned and so on. And of course, how the data, should be treated, and who should treat the data, and so forth, who should interpret the data and so forth. So documentation really, is key. So the other aspect, fundamental aspect of the GLP as far as the OECD guidelines, they are concerned, is the quality characterization, of the test item as well as the test system. Look at the difference. The test system, of course, refers to, either the animal or the plant, that is being studied. Or possibly it could even be, the ecosystem, that is being studied in the case of clinical diagnostics or approval of drugs, the organ or the tissues, that are being used to study a particular drug. So those things, should be characterized, very, very accurately. And of course, the purpose of characterization, is to ensure that any work that is done in one lab, can be purely and very well replicated using another different lab, and the same results, should be obtained. On the other hand, the characterization of the test item or the documentation required of the test item. The test item refers to the specimen. And so the specimen, could be the drug under study, could be a pesticide under study, could be the food additive under study, or even in our case, say the vaccine, that is being studied and so forth. So that's a specimen, that is being analyzed by the test item, by the test system. And so the GLP really requires, very clear detail, on the procedures, so that we can guarantee, like I said, the test system and the test item, can be very well replicated, between different labs. So other fundamentals of OECD GLP, again, I think this one is a bit repetitive. Again, it's how you document the raw data and how you document the final results, and how you store them, in terms of how you archive them. Maybe very importantly is that the data, must be recorded immediately, and that it should be recorded accurately, and it should be recorded legibly. Now, you heard me say, especially in Chem 211, we cannot use, things like pencils and whiteouts, when we are recording the data. They should be recorded permanently. They should be recorded permanently. So, under these guidelines, you are required to document, in the lab notebook, for example, what was done, how it was done, when it was done. It must be dated, who did the work and why it was done the way it was done. And so all that, should be documented within what you call the standard, operating procedures. And then, of course, after that, all that data, should be traceable, it should be kept, securely, and access, to that documentation should be restricted, to only certain persons, which often, would be the quality control analyst, or the quality control analyst, who actually signed, that documentation. And so you're going to see, under the GLP practices, you always need, this idea of quality assurance, to ensure that the data that you get, is authentic, to ensure that the method that you used, is appropriate, to ensure the protocols that were used are validated and functions properly. And so you're going to see things like the quality control charts, are really pertinent, to the guarantee, of the verification, of your data. You heard me talk also, I think, for those who did Chem 211 and 311, the figures of merit are very classically important, in the data validation. So things like how you selected an analytical method, you have to indicate its selectivity or justify its selectivity, and other figures of merit, that really are an index of the performance, of the test system. Remember that, these guys, are the index of the performance of the test system. And as I said, the test system, can be an analytical instrument, such as the ICP, and so forth, okay? And so you must ensure, that the data that you are getting, is in compliance, to what is expected, of that particular instrumentation. Can it achieve, a certain set of accuracy? Is it precise enough to give you the right results and so on? That is how the right, limit of detection that is required, for the problem that you're trying to address. So again, all these are pertinent, to the GLP principles as far as the quality assurance of your data, is concerned. So what happens if a company or an organization or an industry is non-compliant? There are major consequences, of non-compliance, with the GLP. And of course, the non-compliance, can be things like, falsification of data or poor, data assurance, meaning people did not use the right instrumentation, to get the correct data. And so that can lead, of course, to the disqualification of the results. And sometimes when the results are disqualified, of course, the impact, can be very, very significant. Think about, if a certain drug was tested and then the testing approach, was found to be inadequate. So that means, the data, is disqualified and that particular product, cannot make it to market. So of course the impact can be very, very significant. Now, of course, if the falsification, was such that, it was intentional, things like, civil and criminal proceedings, may occur. And of course, hefty penalties, can result from that. As I showed you, in the case of the Procter and Gamble, in the case of the company, that was involved, in earlier on at the inception, of the GLP. So it should indicate that the GLP really, should really be considered a lifestyle, that all of us really as professional chemists, should adhere to as we go about, our work as professionals. So then the next chapter, brief chapter, you're going to talk about, the good manufacturing practices. The good manufacturing practices, which are very similar, to the good laboratory practices, but there are a few distinctions, that I'd like you to be aware of.